Hi, everyone. We are going to go ahead and get started in just a moment. But in the meantime, if you want to put in the chat where you're tuning in from, we always love to see where everybody is. I see lots of people coming in, so we're going to give it just a second. But for those of you who are just joining us, if you want to put in the chat where you're tuning in from, it is always fun to see where everybody is. And you can also check out those other links that I've put in the chat. All right, I see more people coming in. Like I said, we're going to give it just one more second, and then we will go ahead and get started. So just give it a minute. But if you would like to put in the chat where you're tuning in from, Kensington, very nice. Thank you for joining us. Maryland, Chicago, lovely. Very nice. Thank you for being here. All right. Atlanta, very cool. All right, I think we are going to go ahead and get started just so we make sure we have as much time as possible. But feel free to keep putting in the chat where you're tuning in from. It is always very interesting to see where everybody is. So good evening or afternoon, depending on where you are tuning in from. My name is Sydney Yeager, and I'm the Senior Public Programs Producer here at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's book talk for People of the Image, Jews and Art. Here at the museum, we are dedicated to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice, and more. Thank you so much for joining us today virtually. We hope that if you are able to, that you will visit the museum in person to see our current and upcoming exhibitions, including Art of Freedom, the life and work of Arthur Szyk, which is opening on December 7th, 2025. Closed captions are available on today's program, and instructions on how to turn captions on or off are posted in the chat. If you have questions for our speaker during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box, and we will get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. Again, that's the Q&A box and not the chat. Today, we are extremely honored to be joined by Marc Michael Epstein. Marc has been teaching at Vassar since 1992 and currently serves as Director of Jewish Studies. He has written on various topics in visual and material culture produced by, for, and about Jews. His book, Skies of Parchment, Seas of Ink, Jewish Illuminated Manuscripts, was the winner of the National Jewish Book Award. The Medieval Haggadah, Art, Narrative, and Religious Imagination was selected by the London Times Literary Supplement as one of the best books of 2011. He is currently completing a new book, Disputed Territory, Jewish Spaces in Christian Art, excuse me. So we have a very distinguished guest with us this evening. You can purchase People of the Image, Jews and Art at the link in the chat, and I highly encourage you to do so.
Nice.
So thank you all so much for joining us, and now I'm going to hand things over to Marc.
Thank you so much. I just want to share my screen. Just want to check that you can see that, Sydney. Looks good?
Yes, we can see that.
Okay, super. I'm so pleased to be here tonight. Whenever I hear an introduction to myself, I feel a little bit sheepish because indeed I reside in a space that is the very pinnacle of my field. But it's sort of like living in the penthouse apartment of a one-story building. Because generally, the stuff that I'm interested in, there's only about 6 other people in the world who are interested in it. So what I would like to do is to talk about this book I've just published and perhaps to spark your interest in doing this. And when I say doing it, I really mean doing it because this is a book that emerged from about 35 years of explorations of this topic and, sort of living in my own world with the objects and items that I considered and thought about. And this is sort of my, and of course, presenting it into your world, right? But this is my sort of attempt to make it clear to you that, you know how they say sometimes, don't try this at home, folks. Well, I think that this can be tried and very successfully too at home. And so the book was just published in June. They did a very beautiful job, Penn State University Press. I think it's great gift for weddings, brisses, divorces, funerals, whatever, whatever occasion comes up. And as you can see from the table of contents, the topics are quite diverse. I talk about when we look at a work of art made for Jews, mostly what I look at are illuminated manuscripts made in the Middle Ages for Jewish audiences, Jewish patrons. What are we seeing there? Are we seeing a mirror of life? Are we seeing people's aspirations, etc.? And there's a whole sort of spectrum of questions. I deal with figures that have human bodies and animal faces. And I'm particularly interested when those human bodies, the animal faces that are appended to those human bodies happen to be female, right? So what's going on there? Well, we can look at those images and think we know, but the question is, what do we really know? The protagonists are no longer around to interrogate, right? So we have to speculate, and we have to speculate responsibly. And I talk a lot about doing that in the book. But today, I thought I would concentrate on one topic that I looked at, which seems so simple. It's the fourth topic down there. What is a book, and what is a book for? These are two questions that we think we know the answers to, but I want to sort of demonstrate my method through an examination of that topic. Now, demonstrate my method. Usually when somebody writes a scholarly book, or often when somebody writes a scholarly book, they put at the beginning of each chapter an epigram. And the epigram can be from some great thinker of the past or from some momentous document. Some of my epigrams are from the Beatles and other sort of less academically august venues. But my very first epigram is from my third grade teacher, Mrs. Esther Urist of the Rabbi Harry Halpern Day School in Brooklyn, New York. Maybe third or fourth grade, 1974, I'm not sure. And she was a math teacher, and man, I hated math. And I hated math as much when I finished her class as when I'd started her class. I mean, that she didn't move me in any way to become a math lover. But she posed one very interesting dilemma, which is, imagine that you're in, third or fourth grade and you've done your time, you've slogged through your math homework and you hand it in. And in fact, you somehow miraculously get the answers correctly, right? You get the answers correct, I should say, right? And then the teacher comes back at you, the final straw that breaks the math hating camel's back, and says, okay, this is good, but show your work. Show your work. So as I said, I've been doing this for 35 years, more or less, here at Vassar College, at Oberlin College, at Yale University, at Smith, the University of Toronto, Boston College, various places that I've taught as visiting professor and scholar, and as a faculty, a tenured faculty, and name chair over the years, all these venues. And, I present my work, and people over the years have said things like, well, that's very interesting, but how did you do it? What's your method? And, we're so used to doing certain things that we think that our method should be self-evident. But I decided in this book, finally, to show how it's done. And by showing how it's done, to show you how you too might do it. But I decided today, because, when we come across a new enterprise, people like say like, I don't know anything about art, but I know what I like, right? You've heard that, right? So if I can tell you that if you can read a text, a newspaper, a book, a magazine, right, you can read art in the same way, you might feel a sort of crisis of confidence, but I don't know enough, right? So I'm here to tell you that even somebody who knows enough, some would argue too much, even somebody who knows enough is often wrong. But it's from the wrongness that new ideas emerge. So my topic today is called What is a Book? What is a book for? Or The Book and the Brick, a cautionary tale. It's got a further subtitle, that is The Time I Really Screwed Up. Shortly after the publication of my 2015 book, The Medieval Haggadah, Art, Narrative, and Religious Imagination, that's the one from Yale University Press, it won the National Jewish Book Prize for the Arts, After publishing this, I received a charmingly laudatory bit of fan mail. Dear Professor Epstein, it read. By the way, I don't know how you want to call me, but I often tell my kids, my students, I shouldn't say kids, my president of our college says, refer to them as young adults. So I often say to my young adults, Epstein, Epstein, it doesn't matter, right? There was a dispute in my family as to how it was pronounced. Um, Dear Professor Epstein, it read, after nearly a century of research on the manuscript, you have definitively solved the mystery of the so-called bird's head Haggadah. Ooh-ha. Well, when I received that letter, I had two reactions. First, I was delighted by the writer's use of so-called to identify the phrase bird's head Haggadah. This is the designation that the Israel Museum in Jerusalem uses for manuscript 150/7, a book made by hand in southern Rhineland Valley of what is now Germany around 1300, containing the earliest surviving home liturgy for the Seder, the ritual meal on the eve of Passover. By dint of the fact that the putative bird-headed figures shown in Israel Museum manuscript 150/7 are actually griffin-headed human hybrids, right? You can see they have animal ears and they have beards or manes. They're not strictly birds. They're griffin-headed human hybrids. In my own publications, I renamed the manuscript The Griffin's Head Haggadah. So I was pleased to find that my interlocutor concurred. My other reaction, however, was a sort of testy impatience with the short-sightedness of my correspondence, in spite of his kindly intended words. Because if you believe that there are definitive solutions for iconographic problems, problems of meaning in art, the whole field takes a major step, a giant step, toward paralysis and ossification. Once you understand that there is a meaning and this is the meaning for such and such a thing, that's it. The game's over. There's no point in future development. So rather than simply basking in the adulation, I responded to this poor, well-meaning writer in a manner that, while not exactly nasty or brutish, was rather short and which amply telegraphed my distress. I've only solved it, I dashed off, until you solve it again. Hafachba v'hafechba dekalaba. Turn it over and again turn it over, for all is therein. With these words, the Mishnah, the great epitome of rabbinic legal discussion, valorizes the perpetual return to the wellspring of scripture for material for scholarly rumination and inspiration. While contemporary academic scholars, like the ancient rabbis, are always seeking chidushim, new insights, it's a sad fact that the material upon which we as scholars of art made for medieval Jewish patrons or audiences focus our interpretive lenses is in no way as broad or all-encompassing as scripture. Indeed, in our field, it cannot be, because Jews were subject population, Jewish communities, and Jewish objects of visual interest became subject to the vicissitudes of history, and only a relatively small amount of potential research subjects survives. About this fact, nothing can be done except to be creative and innovative about looking at material we have examined before and about applying insights that have been topics of discussion for some time in the general field of manuscript studies, manuscripts made for Christians, manuscripts made for Muslims, but topics that have been little considered in the subfield of the study of manuscripts made for Jewish patrons and audiences. Turn it over and again turn it over, for all is therein. Like real estate agents, whose credo is to find for their clients the best of what? Location, location, location. The aim and focus of scholars of art made for medieval Jewish patrons and audiences should be to revisit, 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 revisiting works of art on which we have worked over years and decades can yield new insight, both in general and in particular. For instance, when I first started writing about medieval Jewish art, a term I've long since abandoned in favor of speaking about art made for medieval Jewish patrons and audiences, because much of the art was made by non-Jews, for Jews, I understood the Jewish-Christian encounter over the visual arts to be a perpetually and inveterately adversarial struggle. In this wrestling match over symbolic meaning, I thought of Jews as stealthy guerrillas pilfering iconography from Christians, who I viewed as owning the art. If Jewish patrons then flung this symbolism back at Christians with hostile intent in rhetorical or pictorial revenge for Christian denigration of their religion, their peoplehood, and their persons, it only made sense. So here, for instance, we have Saint Dominic preaching against Jews and heretics from the cloister of Santa Maria Novella in Florence, right? The Dominicans, the Dominicanis, the hounds of the Lord, were fighting against wolves, you see at the bottom, Jews and heretics, come to harm the sheep, Christian believers. And you see the wolf, the evil Jew or the heretic, being bitten by the dog. So there, the dog is a symbol of Jews. But here, in a manuscript made for Jews around the same period, roughly, within 50 years, you have a demonic hunter with dogs who is threatening the deer. The deer here, Tzvi, stand in for the Jews, gentle creatures, creatures that are pursued, creatures that are swift in escaping. And the hunter and the dog are the Christians, right? So I used to think, Christians figured Jews as dogs. And so Jews took the symbol and they figured Christians as dogs. It was a simple kind of equation, a kind of, revengeful fantasy. In retrospect, I think this preoccupation on my part may have had as its origin a gift I received from some obviously lighthearted and expansive relative of mine, a book by Simon Wiesenthal, Every Day a Remembrance Day, A Chronicle of Jewish Martyrdom. That volume contained a litany of every libel, attack, horror, massacre, pogrom, and expulsion ever perpetuated upon the Jews, anywhere, anytime, conveniently arranged in the form of an actual daily calendar, right? So you look up May 1st, it tells you how many Jews were killed and where, right? Now, at that time, I was becoming more conscious of my Jewish identity and validating my desire to live as an observant Jew. And the book became a touchstone for connection with a history fraught with pain, suffering, and sorrow. But as a view of Jewish history, it was more than merely lachrymose or tearful. It was actually intellectually inspiring. What it inspired in me was a view that since the Jews must have been very angry as a result of their terrible lot in history, this anger necessarily produced steam that required venting. And art, as I eventually came to argue in my research, provided medieval Jews with a major safety valve, substantially concealed behind a veneer of conformity to apparently conventional symbolism. dogs and hares and dragons and unicorns, just looks exactly like what the Goyim were doing, but concealed behind the surface, beneath the surface, because of the terrible experience of the Jews in the Middle Ages, I argued, was a huge screw you, right? Leveled at the enemy. Somewhere down the line, as a result of my burgeoning historical studies beyond the Wiesenthalian ambit, and certainly culminating with my eager inhalation of Jonathan Elkins's magisterial book, Living Together, Living Apart, rethinking Jewish-Christian relations in the Middle Ages, I eventually came to the realization that, well, one had to buy eggs. Yes, one had to buy eggs. What do I mean by that? That is, although every day, remember, every day, a Remembrance Day, right? Although every day, somewhere, sometime, may very well be a Remembrance Day for Jews, Jews also lived side by side with their Christian neighbors throughout medieval Europe, literally in the shade, in many cases, of the great cathedrals. They had Christian business associates, sometimes friends. In spite of religious restrictions, Jews and Christians traded together. They sometimes ended up traveling and socializing together. Christians brought eggs from Jewish women, and in one or two cases, we know that they commissioned objects from Jewish craftspeople. These craftspeople were simply talented artisans who were self-taught or learned from other similarly gifted individuals. That tutelage would have occurred on a one-to-one basis, even if Jews could often not formally join the Christian guilds of artisans. And the goods these Jewish artisans produced could have been offered for sale, for private sale, without any formal or official market. So rather than continuing to think of the Jewish-Christian encounter over art as a polemic flinging dust-up, I have since come to the conclusion that it was rather more like a mutual fishing expedition. Jews and Christians angled, so to speak, in the same cultural stream, and they pulled out various symbolic motifs: a lion, a dragon, a hare, a unicorn, or say, an angel. And then they each prepared, that is, interpreted these motifs, each according to their own respective way. The interpretations were sometimes warlike and polemic against each other, but they were equally likely to be neutral or simply parallel, and sometimes even consonant with one another. Right? So here you have an angel from the famous Merode altarpiece, which is in the cloisters. You can go up and see it if you visit the Museum of the Jewish Heritage, just travel up the West Side Highway. And there's an angel dressed in Christian liturgical garb with peacock wings, beautiful figure, a young man with long curly hair. And in a roughly contemporary Machzor, High Holiday Prayer book, from Ulm in South Germany, in Augsburg, right? We have an angel dressed identically with the same curly hair, with the same peacock wings, right? Why? Well, in Jewish tradition, angels, what we know of them from the Bible and from rabbinic literature, is that they have wings. But we also know that there are beings that are made of fire and water, right? The conjunctio oppositorum, the conjunction of opposites, right? Some are all fire. They're these very awesome beings that really can't be depicted. And so when it comes time to depict angels, the Jew speaks to the Christian from whom he or she commissions the manuscript and asks for an angel, and the angel comes back looking like what angels looked like in the Middle Ages for Jews and for Christians alike. Many examples of this. It's both amusing and humbling for me to contemplate this nearly 360-degree turnaround in my thoughts on medieval Jewish-Christian relations, right? From polemics and argument all the time, 24/7, 365, to a sort of mutual fishing expedition. And I try to be transparent in my teaching about my intellectual trajectory so as to benefit my students. So I regularly assign them anonymized versions of the introductory overview and methodology chapters of two books, one published about 3 decades ago and one of much more recent vintage, and ask them to compare and contrast the attitudes and conclusions of the two scholars who wrote these books. I delight in their bewilderment when I reveal afterwards that both scholars were, in fact, me, their very own instructor, who has altered his approach so very considerably over the years. But when their consternation passes, they find themselves liberated to espouse positions, to try on theories, to take speculative risks that they know they will have a lifetime to revise, right? I'm a really old guy and I've been revising for 35 years. And they can revise without shame, without misgiving, just as a consequence of intellectual growth over the course of time. That's a very valuable lesson. Whether Jewish-Christian relationships were hedged about with enmity and hatred, or whether they surprise us with their amity and friendship, they display a relative equanimity, right? Neither loving nor hating, but simply coexisting. One thing is indisputable. When it came to the production of cultural artifacts, the differences in the direction that art went and the interpretation of symbols inspired highly collaborative conversations. Around 1280, a Jew with sufficient financial resources could walk into the shop of a commercial manuscript merchant on a high or cathedral street in most Western European cities, streets that were often proximate to the Jewish neighborhoods, and that Jew could commission a manuscript. I can imagine how this worked by retrojecting my own experience working with non-Jewish art presses to publish distinctively Jewish texts. So here's my associate at Beit Venezia, a little institute I run in Venice, Italy. Two associates, Shaul Bassi, who's a professor of Shakespeare studies at Ca' Foscari University, and his associate, and also is part of Beit Venezia. And we are commissioning a printed Haggadah from this gentleman, who's called Pier Paolo Prenolato, who's a master printer, but not Jewish. And a discussion, as you can see, is ensuing. I'm sure this is how it went in the Middle Ages. And I can even reconstruct the discussion for you. The Jew walks into a manuscript artist's studio, and this process begins with conversations that went something like the following. I've designated which is the merchant here, M, and which is the Jew. Do you know where that quote is from? Merchant of Venice, right? When the courtroom scene happens, Jessica, who's disguised as Portia, is disguised as the lawyer. Portia says, "Which is the merchant and which is the Jew?" Right? Whether the patron or agent, I've designated J. So the Jew says, "I'd like to commission a Haggadah." The Christian merchant says, "A Hawada?" A Haggadah, it's a sort of prayer book. I have a scribe, so you don't need to worry about the Hebrew language, but it's gonna need pictures. Oh, okay, a prayer book with pictures. You mean like a book of hours or a psalter? Well, I don't know, it's a festival prayer book. It's for Pesach. Pesach? Yeah. Pasqua? Oh, you mean for Easter, says the Christian merchant, because it has the same name. No, 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 not for Easter. Well, says the Jew, sort of for our Easter, the Jewish Easter. Oh, okay, I think I see, says the Christian. What kind of pictures do you need? Well, for one example, I'll need a picture of Moses fleeing from Midian with his family after Pharaoh finds out that he killed an Egyptian. Oh, so you mean, says the Christian, Old Testament illustrations? The Jew says, no, no, Chumash illustrations. Chumash, says the Christian. You know, the five books of Moses. Oh, sorry. No, no. Yes, that's what you call the Old Testament, I guess. So yes, yes, Old Testament illustrations. Do you have anything? The merchant shows the Jew a scene of Jesus, Mary, and Joseph fleeing into Egypt after Herod seeks to kill them. The merchant says, what about this? Old man, young mother, you have the baby, the donkey, and they're fleeing. They're fleeing from the Holy Land to Egypt as it happens, but the scribe can just label it however you want. Oh, says the Jew, that's perfect. Just take out the halos. We don't do halos. Give me two babies, make the father much younger, the donkey much more horse-like, and give me another figure, a happy old man greeting them. And oh yeah, give me a dog as well. And flip the model so it reads from right to left to fit the Hebrew. How does that sound? Christian merchant says, fine with me. It'll cost you a bit over, at least for the extra figure. So here is what you see. This is um, a process whereby the Holy Family's flight into Egypt in a Christian manuscript, Catalonia in the late 14th century, becomes Moses's family's return to Egypt. No halos, two babies, a horse-like donkey, and a doggy. Okay. Now I've written about this ad nauseum. I'm not going to talk about that image today, but I just wanted to illustrate the process. To return to the Griffin's Head Haggadah as a case of, in point of returning to things you've looked at before, the creatures it depicts are not birds. As I said, they don't even have the heads of birds, let alone pronounced birds' heads, as the Israel Museum's own website puts it. They are animals with eagle beaks, the tawny manes of lions, comprised of human beards and hair, and lion ears. These hybrid heads, unlike those of any known bird, but as I mentioned at the outset, they are patently analogous with the heads of griffins. Somebody tries to argue that their ears are pig ears, but I won't even go into that. Images of griffins are found throughout this period in mosaics, decoration of weaponry, metalwork and jewelry, fabric arts, and, of course, in many, many, many manuscripts made for Christians and even for Jews. Yet the Israel Museum persists in labeling the manuscript the Bird's Head Haggadah, for so, like Adam naming the animals, did Professor Narkis, one of the great scholars, identify those creatures in the days of yore. Let us imagine that scholars had been referring to British Library Manuscript Additional 27210 as the Silver Haggadah for years, because an early curator of the then British Museum Hebrew collection had a visual disability and had thus labeled the manuscript. I feel certain that when someone finally took a good color photograph of the book that demonstrated that the brilliant backdrops of the illuminations were in fact golden rather than silver, the designation would have been altered. In the case of manuscript 157, there is no evidence of any kind to insist that the manuscript should be thought of depicting bird-headed rather than griffin-headed people. It's a case of the subjective observation based upon the distinctly unbird-like ears and manes of the depicted creatures, an observation that should, frankly, be patently obvious to any 5-year-old with eyes. But the institutional lack of willingness to incorporate new research, if it does not come from the proper source, is an indication of the obduracy of the field, which cannot advance if it resists in assimilating fresh evidence from wherever it emerges. Speaking of fresh evidence, to our point, this charming fellow seems to be reading a book on a grassy knoll under a tree with a cheerful smile on his face. And so it was that I read the image for about 20 years, ever since I first encountered the Barcelona Haggadah, made in Catalonia around 1340, which is now in the British Library. Of course, given the context of this detail on the page that depicts the Israelites enslaved in Egypt, as you see, Avodim hayinu leFaro b'Mitzrayim, we were enslaved to Pharaoh in Egypt, I was always rather puzzled at the reader's cheerful appearance and engagement in the activity of reading. We were enslaved, proclaims the central text rubric, Avadim hayinu. And the page is crowned with a bit of interesting art symbolism depicting a hare being served a drink by a dog, with the implication that although the Israelites or the Jews were enslaved to the Egyptians or the Gentiles at some point in history, one day the Egyptian dogs would serve them, right? It's a sort of escape valve in the Middle Ages if you find yourself as a subjected population to imagine a brighter future. So in this context, why would an enslaved Israelite be reading a book in the midst of the industrious crowd swirling about him? This is a page I return to time and again in my research. Remember, hafachba v'hafechba, return to it, turn it over. I thought about it and discussed the elongated arm of the man treading the clay, directly below the words, bizeroa nituya, with an outstretched arm, quoting scripture. I was intrigued by how these little golden circles, one in the bottom of the page and one at the very top, become sort of luminaries. The one in the lower margin is clearly, though it's decorative, is clearly represents the sun baking the bricks in the brick mold, while the two at the top might represent the sun and moon shining with restored equal light at the end of time, when the Israelites have their triumph and revenge, per the Midrash, right? Isaiah even says, then in the future to come, the light of the moon shall be as the light of the sun. I thought of the rooster at the top left as proclaiming the dawn of salvation. I thought of the dog heads spewing forth these buds, these little flower buds, not yet blossoms, representing likewise the budding of a new era. As in several other examples in medieval art produced for Jews, the agent of persecution, here the dog, sets into motion the mechanism for, or in this case, produces the symbol of redemption, the buds. Right? Rooster, dogs producing the buds. The image also operates out of time, performing in multiple time zones simultaneously. The past, indicated by the phrase, Avadim hayinu, we were enslaved, and the image of the Egyptian enslavement. The present, which is shown by the medieval clothing and the fact that the phrase describing the enslavement is read on each and every Seder night in the present moment against the backdrop of the Seder activity going on outside the page and around the book. And the future, where the end of time is signaled by the hare being served a drink by the dog, and by the cock crowing to announce a new dawn, and the sun and moon rising simultaneously with equal brightness, and the buds of redemption flowering from the very jaws of the oppressor. Right? So we have past, we were slaves. Present, medieval clothing, repetition every night, every year, at the Seder. And the future, right? This imagined future where Jews dominate their former enemies. But who then is that reader at the lower left? What is he doing there? does he turn our attention toward the next page? Remember, Hebrew goes from right to left, right? Pausing in his reading to raise his eyes, just as he comes to the words at the top of the next page, HaKodesh Baruch Hu, right? HaKodesh Baruch Hu, the Holy Blessed One, right? Is he gazing up at God, so to speak? Or is this reader holding his book, gazing at the words, Ve'afilu kulanu chachamim, even if we were all wise, right? Even if we were all wise, we would still be required to tell of the Exodus. Is that what he's looking at? Are the images on the bottom of the opposite page a hare surrounded by two dogs here, right? Two horsemen fighting with lances, and a hare who is chasing a dog? Are those visions that are produced by or emerging from the reading of this little fellow? Are they perceptions in one case of reality as it is, the hare pursued by the dogs, the knights fighting each other, and in the other case, the hare pursuing the dogs of the world as one day the reader imagines it is destined to be? Is this reader the Jew with the book, preserving the text even in the midst of suffering, transmitting it outside the page? Note that the reader is dressed not in a scholar's long gown, but in the short practical tunic and head covering of a simple laborer. Is the reader then counter-rabbinic, anti-elite, proto-socialist? Is the reader, in fact, every Jew who has ever recounted the story of the Exodus, every Jew who has ever read the Haggadah? Sadly, the answer to every single one of those heady, fresh, and stimulating questions is a resounding no. Why? Well, because the reader is actually no reader at all. A couple of years ago in a Vassar classroom, as I expostulated on those points I just made in a fervor of quasi-prophetic scholarly ecstasy, suspensefully attenuating my arguments, piling on my interpretations with dramatic flair, theatrically altering my pitch and tone. One student in the back of the room raised a hand. Mr. Epstein, she asked, I don't mean to interrupt, but it looks to me as if what's going on in the bottom of the page is that the Israelite on the right is treading out the clay. The one in the middle is forming the bricks. And the one at the left, well, he isn't reading. He has two finished bricks in his hand, and he's about to put them into the basket to be hauled up to the middle register where the Israelites are building the building. Oh my God. Klug ist mir. Indeed, the student was correct. The little fellow at the bottom of the page was not a reader, but a builder. Oy, I felt completely embarrassed, right? Like after 20 years of talking about this image and looking at this image, I should just pack up my hyperbolic rhetoric and head home. I don't exactly remember how I reacted. I'm sure I praised the student and thanked her for her insight, but all the while my cheeks were understandably burning at the foolish way I had gone on. I, who had always made a virtue of underplaying jargon in favor of telling like it is. Read any of my books. They're completely readable, even to my mother. Right, Mom? Thanks, Mom. I always have been in favor of telling like it is. I've been caught spinning a web of words, 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 full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. I was devastated. Hey. Once I recovered, however, I found myself genuinely grateful for my student's observation and for the wake-up call it proved to be regarding what we think we see and therefore think we know. I kept my chagrin fresh in my mind, right under the surface of my considerable ego. As a corrective, anytime I sense myself crossing the line into interpretive arrogance. And like the exercise, revealing my shift in thinking from my early work to my later work about medieval Jewish-Christian relations, this humiliation proved to be a great teaching tool, revealing both my method and its fallibility. It humanized the process of scholarship and helped my students to see the fact that their oh so erudite professor, even me, right, after so many years of contemplating an image, could get it totally and utterly wrong. This meant that they too were liberated to reevaluate long-held assumptions about art, right? Whether their own assumptions or anyone else's, and to turn it again in the course of their own careers. Now, as it happens, I recounted this cautionary tale at a recent international conference in medieval studies. And at that conference, in the audience, there was a Vassar alum, Maeve Doyle, of the class of '07. And she wrote me in the private chat, and her comment once again turned my consideration of this image on its head. Her remark was this: in your Barcelona Haggadah example, those bricks totally look like a book, but I think the artist knew that, right? I think the artist knew that. Well, if Maeve, here she is, saw the image that way, the way I did before I was enlightened by my highly observant student, it was entirely possible, though no way provable, that the medieval patrons and audience of the Barcelona Haggadah themselves saw the object both as a brick and a book. The fact that they could have done so simultaneously and without contradiction accords with what we know of the inventiveness of the medieval symbolic universe and of the multi-meaningfulness of the medieval imagination. If I took up such a view, I could salvage my previous brilliant insights about the book and about the subject position of its reader, and those insights could coincide with the objective material reality of the narratologically more probable brick in the hands of a figure who was not a reader but a builder. I could have my cake and eat it too. Huh. One argument in support of the idea that the authorship of the Barcelona Haggadah knew what they were doing in painting a book-like brick, or a brick-like book, is the fact that the two bricks held by the figure lack volume, physical volume. This is in distinct contrast with the bricks depicted already in place in the structure in the middle register. You see the slightly reddish rims of those bricks? It gives them a slight three-dimensionality that adds to the illusion of substantial material bulk in the building shown being built. Additionally, the builder holds the bricks with fingertips alone, which makes them appear to be objects of book-like lightness rather than brick-like density. Finally, there's a little bit of learning, which every Jew in medieval Iberia would have been familiar. A verbal pun that parallels and perhaps bears upon this visual ambiguity. It's from the end of the Musaf, the additional service chanted every Sabbath morning in the synagogue. The rabbis are quoted as having said of Torah scholars, Talmidei Chachamim Marbim Shalom Ba'olam. Students of Torah increase peace in the world, as the prophet Isaiah said, all your children, Banaich, shall be taught by God, and your children shall increase peace. That's from Isaiah, right? And then the rabbis comment, don't read the word as banayich, your children, but rather as bonayich, your builders. It is in the book of Exodus, after all, that the Israelite people, literally the children of Israel, come into their own. They do so through the encounter with the other, the Egyptian other, which includes oppressive enslavement as a consequence for repeating ingrained patterns of sibling rivalry and parental favoritism throughout the book of Genesis. The transformation of God's children into enslaved builders begs the question of what they build. On the material and narratological level, certainly they build Pitom and Ramses, store cities for Pharaoh, as we are told in Exodus 1:11. But on another level, their experience in enslavement, their encounter with the other, is meant to develop their potential to become builders of peace through the study of Torah in each exile, in any and all difficult circumstances. The word peace, shalom, betokens balance and reconciliation of the polyvalent and therefore apparently incompatible elements, the self and the other, primarily. And it results in a conjunction of opposites, an ultimate completion and equilibrium. The possibility that our builder of physical buildings with actual bricks is also a reader, a student, and thus a builder of peace through Torah study is a very moving one. If we read the figure in this way, it is indeed significant that he is positioned on the open page, for he is a builder through study who has his eyes on heaven, on the Kadosh Baruch Hu, one second. He has his eyes on heaven, on the Kadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy Blessed One, on the opposite page. He is a builder because at the very same time as his mind projects the image of knights in conflict and a hare confronted by dogs, manifestations of the present oppressive reality, his heart intuits that there will be a time when the pursued will triumph over their pursuers and the buds of redemption will burst forth, as envisioned in the other, more hopeful illustration on the page. The lesson for us as students of art: the material and the spiritual, the practical and the intellectual, humility and innovation. Bricks and books are all necessary elements in the construction of shalom, peace, stasis, equilibrium, balance between self and other. But although this completeness is our ultimate desire, it's a goal rather than something that is achieved in a single blinding insight. It is more usually a process that unfolds slowly over time as a result of turning and turning, of changing, of growing, of shifting perception again and again. Hafachba, de'afechba, ve'hafechba, de'kalaba, right? Turn it over again, for all is therein, and look into it and become gray and old therein, and do not move away from it, for you have no better portion than it. Thank you very much. I appreciate your attention. And here's my email. If you have any questions, you can email me anytime. I'm pretty good at answering them, unless they're crazy questions, of course, in which case I may not have an answer. But I think Sydney has some questions for me. I guess I should stop sharing. Do any of them involve specific images, Sydney, that they want me to go back to?
There's one or two that might, so you might want to just keep it up for a second.
Okay, I'll keep it up.
But I'll start with one that I know does include a specific image. And I want to thank you so much for that really awesome presentation.
Thanks. It was a pleasure.
So this one's kind of easy, but what is the gold circle that is shown on the woman holding the chicken, and also the Jewish man that you showed?
Oh, okay. So that's the Jewish badge that was required in various places in Ashkenaz and other places. It was a circle of a handbreadth in size that was to be worn on the front and the back of one's garment after the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, and it was intended to interdict interaction, social and sexual, between Jews and Christians. So you knew who you were talking to when you wore that badge. And of course, it is the predecessor of the famous yellow star.
Thank you. So another question that came in is, you talked about how a lot of Jews were commissioning Christian artists to create these works. And is there any evidence that Christians were ever uncomfortable creating these works, or was it all kind of
Look, we don't, money talks, right? Money
talk?
talks.
Yep.
So if you, let's say you commission a home from a famous architect, right? You tell that architect, you don't say you're a genius architect, put as many bathrooms as you like in the house, right? You tell them down to the detail of that Viking stove you want and what kind of hood, right?
Mhm.
Exactly what you want in your home in the Hamptons. And it doesn't matter if the architect is black, white, yellow, red, green, or believes, that God has three heads or not, right? The money talks. So if there was a problem, we don't see it. And what we have is the evidence of things being produced. Things were produced, right? When things weren't produced or there was an impasse in the conversation, that is probably represented by something that doesn't exist as a result of a conversation that went wrong. And I can't show you negative evidence. I can't show you the evidence that doesn't exist. So every manuscript that we have is an evidence of a conversation. But I have to tell you something. A few years ago, the library in Munich called me up and said, you have to take a look at this manuscript we have. It's the earliest manuscript, illuminated manuscript that we know of, Jewish, for a Jewish patron. And it's a manuscript of the Rashi commentary, very famous medieval commentary. And the paint is flaking. I say, well, you have the wrong phone number because I don't do restoration and I'm not a scientist. You need a paint. No, they said, no, you want to see it. So they showed me what was going on. The page is from the book of Numbers. It says, V'yedaber Hashem Moshe, and God spoke to Moses. And there's a picture of Moses and Joshua, and they're speaking to something in the upper right-hand corner, which is represented as a kind of quarter of a circle, right? And previously there was gold on the circle, but now the gold flaked off. And they showed me the ultraviolet scan of it. And there in the circle is a little picture of Jesus giving a blessing with a halo.
Oh.
Obviously, what happened was this, probably the first that we know of, manuscript was sent out. The Christians said, what do you want in this picture? He said, well, God talking to Moses. So the Christian
Mhm.
put God as far as the Christian
Yeah.
understood God to be. It came to the Jew. The Jew said, oh my God, we can't do that. The Christian said, well, what can I do? I already just scrape it off, put some gold on it, do anything. Just don't put
Yeah.
Jesus in my manuscript, right? So that's an evidence of an interaction. Did the Jew refuse to pay for the manuscript? Probably not, because now he got gold on his manuscript, right? Did the Christian feel bad? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe he thought the Jew was crazy. We don't know, right? But these interactions exist. We don't know how people felt about them because they didn't leave evidence of it.
Right. That's so interesting.
Cool, right?
I think that also leads into sort of another question that we got, which were Jewish and Christian artists, is there any evidence that they ever worked together, or were they kind of doing things?
Right. So there was a guild system where you worked as an artisan with other artisans under the patronage of a particular saint. So, St. Anthony's Guild of, I don't know, shoemakers, right? And these were both industrial arts and fine arts, right? So both shoemakers and stained glass workers, because it was all one continuum then. There was very little distinction between the fine or theoretical arts and the practical arts.
Mhm.
And in most places and times, Jews weren't allowed to join the guilds, or they chose not to join the guilds because they were Christian fellowships. You had to get together and have dinner with these guys, and there was always a big pig with an apple in its mouth. You know the old story. I was walking past a totally trafe restaurant on the Upper West Side, and I see my rabbi in there, and I couldn't believe it. I go to speak to him. I said, Rabbi, you're sitting here. You're sitting in the window of the restaurant. You're eating this gigantic suckling pig here in the window of the restaurant. The rabbi says, "Oi, unbelievable! I come in here, such a fancy place. You order an apple, and look how they serve it." Right? So a Jew could not go to these banquets, right? So whether they were banned from the guilds, as people used to say, or they chose not to join the guilds, or you know, there wasn't that much Jewish guild activity in in conjunction with Christians. But Jews started their own work sort of organizations at various places and times in history as well.
Gotcha. So we are running a little short on time, so I'm just going to ask
Mm,
one final question.
right.
But can you tell us, we talked a little bit at the beginning about the next book that you're working on, but can you
Uh,
tell us about what you're working on next and if it builds on any of what we've seen here tonight?
So thank you. That's a very good question. I'm striking out in another direction, which is this. I'm interested in Christian art. I happen to deal with Jews. I know I'm a big Jewy Jew, but I deal with Jews because Jews are bon à penser. Jews are good to think with about other cultures, other minorities. So if I'm interested in African Americans, I want to study Jews. If I'm interested in Asians, right, I want to study Jews because Jews are a minority and they have a long and recorded history. But
Mhm.
now I'm going to do what I really like to do, which is look at Christian art. And I like to look at Christian art, art made by and for Christians, because it is different from what I Jew all day. I'm tired of Jewing, right? So imagine this. You see a painting of what's called an Annunciation. There's the angel Gabriel announcing to Mary, the Virgin Mary, that Jesus will be born, that God is illuminating, God is coming into the world, right? It takes place in a room. What kind of room is it? Well, you could say it's the ultimate Christian room. God is coming to the world, the Christian God. This is the ultimate Christian scene. But here's news for you guys. Jesus hasn't arrived yet. This is
Right.
not a Christian room, right? It's actually a Jewish room.
Yeah.
Or Jesus is debating with the scholars in the temple in Jerusalem. What
Mhm.
does the temple look like? Well, for a medieval Christian, that room is a Jewish room, but they don't know how to articulate it. So they either show it as blank, having symbols in it that somehow predict Christianity, or sometimes, and I love these, with a little penny print of Moses on the wall instead of a print of Jesus or the saints, right? Or in the case of Carpaccio's Birth of the Virgin, a little icon on the wall that says in Hebrew, this is Christian art in the Renaissance, Brucha haba, blessed is the one who comes, right?
Mhm.
To sort of indicate that it's not yet a Christian room. Jesus is in the temple. What's a temple? It's a kind of cathedral. Ah, but if it's a cathedral, what does the art in the cathedral look like? The stained glass, the statues, right?
Right.
And they did conceptualize this. So I'm interested in how Jews thought about, I mean, how Christians thought about Jewish spaces or non-Christian or pre-Christian spaces in their art. So it's related to what I've done, but it's different. But now it's 8 o'clock and everybody has to go and do what they have to do. So thank you. It's been a great pleasure. Please do write me. I'm really excited to hear from you. And Sydney, you're the best host. And you're welcome here anytime.
Well,
So,
I appreciate it. And I will make it a point to stop by for sure.
okay.
And thank you
Okay.
so much for doing this with us. And I also want to thank everybody who joined us this evening.
Especially my mom. Thank her, please.
Yes, yes,
Yes.
for
Okay.
sure. And I highly encourage everyone to purchase People of the Image, Jews and Art, which again, you can do at the link in the chat. And if you enjoyed today's program, we hope you'll also consider making a donation to support the museum at mjhnyc.org/support, and also joining us for our upcoming programs, which you can find at mjhnyc.org/current events. You can also watch past programs and view and share today's recording, which will be available later this week on the museum's YouTube channel. Thank you again, Mark. It was really amazing to have you. And thank you to everyone again. Have a great night, and we'll see you all soon. Thanks so
Thank you
much.
so much. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.